Good afternoon. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives this afternoon, and a special welcome to those of you who are joining us on our YouTube channel, and a very special welcome to the teachers here from the Gilden Lehrman Institute. It's nice to have you in the audience today. Today's author has researched one of the most important summit meetings of World War II, the Potsdam Conference, in Germany just a few months after the Nazi war machine had been defeated. It was at Potsdam that President Harry Truman, Marshal Joseph Stalin, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and his successor Clement Attlee created the boundaries in which the Cold War was fought. Potsdam would earn its place in history as the major Allied conference after the war in Europe had ended, even as the Japanese were still resisting the successful Allied push toward their home islands in the Pacific. I'll get back to Potsdam in a moment, but first I'd like to tell you about two programs coming up soon here in the McGowan Theater. Tomorrow evening at 7, we'll present a Writers and Scholars Roundtable that will explore some of the little-known events of the Civil Rights era. The program will include a panel which includes 3 Pulitzer Prize-winning authors, as well as scholars of the period. Next Wednesday, on July 22nd at noon, we'll welcome Arthur Downey, author of the book The Creole Affair, the Slave Rebellion that led the U.S. and Great Britain to the brink of war. Downey writes about the most successful slave rebellion in American history and its effect on diplomacy, the domestic slave trade, and the definition of slavery itself. If you want to know more about these and all of our public programs, please refer to our monthly calendar. There are copies in the lobby as well as sign-up sheets where you can receive it either by regular mail or email. And another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our outreach and education activities, and there are membership applications also in the lobby. Today's featured book is Potsdam, The End of World War II and the Remaking of Europe by Michael Neiberg. It was at Potsdam that the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union agreed on the shape of the post-war world, including how authority over Germany would be divided among them and France. It takes a close look at the Potsdam Conference, which began 70 years ago this Friday, and its long-range implications and outcomes. For this book, Michael Neiberg did research in at least 3 National Archives facilities. He received a grant from the Truman Library Institute to delve into the Harry S. Truman papers, including map room files, the naval aid files, and Mr. Truman's longhand notes. He also spent time at the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library, looking at Harry Hopkins' papers. And finally, at the National Archives at College Park, he used materials in the records of international conferences, commissions, and expositions. The Financial Times reporter Tony Barber says Neiberg blends narrative verb with analytical insight to bring to life a conference that threw together Truman, Stalin, and Churchill, then Attlee. Washington historian James Banner writes in one of his weekly standard dispatches that Neiberg shows how differing views within and then between delegations gradually made way for the final agreement at Potsdam. Michael Neiberg is chair of history in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He's written books about both world wars. He holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan and his master's and doctorate from Carnegie Mellon University, and he previously taught at the Air Force Academy. Please welcome Michael Neiberg.
Well, thank you, sir, for that introduction, and thank you to everybody here at the National Archives. It is not possible for me and the people that do what I do to do what we do without the National Archives. And I do have my archives reader's card here. It is expired. I am going to fix that before I leave the building. So thank you very much. What I'd like to do today is introduce some of the themes that appear in this book. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about what this book is and what this book is not. My interest in this book came from really 2 things. It came first and foremost from the kinds of things I do at the Army War College, part of which is looking at the transition from periods of war to periods of peace and how states manage that. How do you go from a period of conflict to a period of trying to create long-term resolutions of those conflicts? And the second thing that I was really interested in was the weight of history on individuals. How people respond, maybe without even knowing it, to the great events that have brought them to where they are. People have a vision of history in their minds, whether they know it or not, whether they quote-unquote like history or not, whether they study history or not. They have a vision in their heads of how you got to where you are. And that vision impacts the way that you see the present, and for policymakers, it certainly impacts the decisions that you make and the advice that you render. What I did not want this book to be is another book that would say, and then Truman turned to Stalin and said. There are two of those books already out, both of which were written in the height of the Cold War. So what I wanted to do with this book was to get away from who said what to whom, and I wanted to get away from the presumption that a Cold War was coming. I wanted to see 1945, I wanted to see the environment of Potsdam the way that the leaders themselves saw it. They, of course, didn't know that a Cold War was coming. Most of them left Potsdam confident that although there would be conflict between the three states and conflicts for the world to figure out, a Cold War, that is a conflict between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, was not inevitable. In fact, most of them left Potsdam believing it wasn't even likely. Here I want to touch on really three themes for today's talk. The first is, how did the leaders of 1945 see their role at Potsdam? And I'll give you the quick answer up front. They saw it not as the start of the Cold War, but as the end of 30 years of total war in Europe from 1914 to 1945. What they understood themselves to be doing was fixing the problems not of Pearl Harbor, not of Poland in 1939, and not of Munich, but of solving the problems of 1914, and specifically solving the problems that the generation before them had created with the Treaty of Versailles and the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. The second thing I wanted to look at was, again, the weight of history. What these men were seeing, what their perspective was, what prism they were seeing Europe through. And when I say men, incidentally, they were all men who made the key decisions. Although there were female reporters, this was mostly done by men. Third, individuals and their role in history. This provides a strange laboratory for an historian. There are two things that happen in the time of Potsdam. The first is that President Franklin Roosevelt died in April of 1945, putting Harry Truman instead in the presidency just weeks before Potsdam opens. And Truman is a remarkable figure in this regard, because Truman had had almost no preparation for dealing with an event this momentous, either before he became vice president or after. And second, in the middle of the Potsdam Conference, a remarkable thing happened. The British people voted, and they voted Winston Churchill's Conservative Party out of power, much to everybody's surprise. In his place came Clement Attlee, a man that so few Americans knew that they misspelled his name in their diaries and in their letters, and American photographers had taken no photographs of him prior to the election results. Those two men take the place of their illustrious predecessors. So the first thing I'd like to do here is set the stage. This is what Berlin looked like in 1945. This is just outside the Brandenburg Gate. This is looking to what is now the Adlon Hotel, was then as well. The absolute ruin of Germany and of Berlin stunned people. Even those people whose job it had been to direct this war could not believe what they were seeing of a city like Berlin. And I can't prove it, but at the very last minute, Stalin announced that he would be one day late arriving in Berlin. This gave the American and British delegates especially one day to do a very special and very bizarre kind of tourism through Berlin. I think the Russians wanted that to happen. In 1919, President Wilson had famously refused to go to the Western Front, saying that he didn't want his heart to grow hard by seeing what had been done by the Germans on the Western Front. Stalin's delay in coming to Potsdam allowed the Americans and British to see it for themselves. It impressed upon them two things. One, the absolute devastation that Germany had faced, unlike anything that anybody had faced at the end of the First World War. And second, the necessity, somehow, to rebuild this, to somehow bring this back out of the ashes. And of course, at this point, nobody knew exactly how to do that. Nobody knew exactly even if you did want to do that. There were plenty of voices, many of them Russian, but a few of them American as well, who wanted to see Germany remain devastated. Most famously, the outgoing American Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, had argued for something that became known as the Morgenthau Plan, which essentially called for breaking Germany into as many as 9, as few as 5 independent states with no federal government, and pastoralizing it, meaning taking away its industry forever. There was also the fundamental questions. of whether the Allies could allow the occupied Germans to live better than the Russians, French, and Poles whom they had victimized. And there remained the fundamental question from 1919. What had caused these wars? Was the problem a fundamental imbalance of power on the European continent? Was the problem a lack of integration of the European economic and political structures? Or was the problem something to do with Germany itself? And this problem lasted well into the 1950s. Right? A friend of mine from high school wrote a book about this, about the State Department's use of Hollywood movies to try to project American values into Germany. And one of the things that the Americans did was export a lot of cowboy movies to Germany. The Germans asked the question back of State Department officials, if you were allowed to kill your Indians, why weren't we allowed to kill our Jews? That backfired. The Germany of 1945, unlike the Germany of 1919, was completely defeated. Yet the question remained, would the German people accept responsibility and guilt for their actions? Truman's bodyguard, who had 4 German-American grandparents and who spoke German himself, was particularly on the lookout in his time in Berlin, listening to what he heard on the streets without revealing that he spoke the language. And what he heard did not reassure him, that the Germans were sorry they had been defeated, but they were not willing to accept guilt for what had happened. There had to be some way to drive home to Germany its defeat and its guilt without repeating the cycle from 1919. There had to be some way to do it. And in this context, the final setting of the peace conference, Potsdam, had a very nice symbolism. It's the Russians who choose it, and they choose it largely for 2 reasons. One, it is relatively intact, and 2, it is the symbol of the 2 kinds of German aristocracy that they're trying to defeat. Potsdam is, of course, the home of the great palaces of the German aristocracy. It's the place where Kaiser Wilhelm II signed the order to mobilize the German army in 1914. And the conference house itself, the Sicilienhof Palace, was built for the German Crown Prince during World War I. Potsdam was also the home to the German film industry in the 1920s and 1930s, the pro-Nazi German film industry. It's the name Potsdam and the adjacent suburb of Babelsberg were code words, just like Beverly Hills or Hollywood would be for the American film industry. So the notion here was that you could stop German militarism in the very place where it had begun. I wanted to talk about these kind of analogies at peace. And here I am picking up off of a book called Analogies at War, written by a brilliant Oxford political scientist named Yuen Foong Kong. And Kong argued, looking at the American decision to put ground troops into Vietnam in 1965, Kong argued that the single most determining factor of what an individual policymaker would recommend in 1965 was the historical analogy that person drew to what they were looking at. In short, if a policymaker saw Munich 1938, that is, stop them now before they get too big, they were likely to argue for a massive American intervention in 1965. If they saw the Korean War as an analogy, that is, expect half victories and expect this to go on a long time, they were likely to recommend much less. And if they saw, as an analogy, the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, then they were likely to argue for not committing American resources at all. His argument is that the way to understand the way American policymakers reacted was literally to understand their vision of history. So I wanted to do this as well. What was the dominant analogy that people in 1945 drew? And there were 4, and I'm going to do them from least used to most used. The least used was Alsace and Lorraine. That is the argument that if you take territory away from a people, it will only create the desire that they're going to have to take land back. Therefore, you can't change the boundaries of Europe at all. Behind that is the historical analogy of the Dawes and Young plans, the American plans to restructure German debt in the interwar years. The new American Secretary of State, James Burns, believed that that had been the fundamental problem. The United States had taken on responsibility for European debt in a way that was unsound for the Americans and unhelpful for the Europeans. Above all, Burns believed, the United States could not do that again. The British argument is largely that you are, in fact, seeing a repeat of Neville Chamberlain and the Munich Agreement. Only this time, it's not the Nazis that you're appeasing, it's the Soviets. But, and this shouldn't come as any surprise to most of you, the dominant historical analogy is the Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles. The men of 1914 understood that what they were doing was fixing the problems of the generation before them. They didn't always agree on what the Treaty of Versailles meant. They didn't always agree on what the fundamental problems had been. But they all agreed that the men of 1919 had made terrible mistakes and that their generation could not afford to make those same mistakes. And I want to stress here, most of the people who went to Potsdam in 1945, with the exception of the Russians, had either been at the Paris Peace Conference or had been deeply informed. It was the event that shaped their lives. Harry Truman had not been there, but James Burns had been there as an advisor to Woodrow Wilson. Winston Churchill had been there for part of it. John Maynard Keynes, the British economic advisor, had been at both conferences. So to these men, it's not like 1919, when some of the statesmen of Europe looked back vaguely a century earlier to the Concert of Europe in 1815 for vague historical examples. These were events from their own lifetime. All of them thought in terms of the 1919 problem, the 1919 disaster. The first words Harry Truman said at the Potsdam Conference were a warning not to repeat the mistakes of Versailles. Even before the treaty negotiations had begun, the conference negotiations had begun, Joseph Stalin had said the same thing to Truman's envoy, Joseph Davies. And again, this is not ancient history. This is living history to these guys. The Russians were not invited to the Paris Peace Conference, but they too were scarred by it, mostly in the creation of an independent Poland that the Russian government opposed and the Versailles Treaty put in place. This is the map of 1919 Europe. In Russian diplomatic correspondence of 1920s and into the 1930s, the Russians very often referred to Poland as Western Belarus, to deny it even a name on the map. And one German diplomat referred to Poland as the bastard child of Versailles. So what were the mistakes that they saw? Well, there are three that largely came up. One was the reparations question. Again, this is an American issue in particular, although it is also John Maynard Keynes' issue, that it doesn't make any sense to take resources out of the same country you're going to demand reparations from. That's a recipe for disaster. For Burns, there was the additional problem that the United States had taken on some of that debt responsibility. Second, the Americans believed that redrawing the borders of Europe, and the British believed this too, had created more problems than it had solved. That is, the effort of the great powers in 1919 to make this map had created more problems than it had solved. And third, especially a Russian view, the problem was inviting small states to participate. Stalin himself said, a state is not virtuous simply because it is small. In Stalin's view, Belgium, Poland, Serbia had been the cause of the two world wars. The great powers had not gone to war for fundamental existential problems for themselves, but as a result of what their client states did or because of states on their borders. As a result, unlike the Paris Peace Conference, the Potsdam Conference will feature just three countries: the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. A Polish delegation is there for 15 minutes to plead its case. The French, much to their dismay, are not invited. No other third parties are invited. Moreover, the diplomats that met in 1919, the British are especially good at this, 1945, the British diplomats are especially good at this, were aware that with one exception, the issues they were dealing with in 1945 would have been perfectly familiar to these men in 1919. Those issues involved, one, what to do with Germany in the post-war world. Two, what to do about reparations. Three, how to handle the map of Europe so that it ethnically and politically fits together better. Four, what role should the United States play in the post-war world? And five, what role should multilateral organizations play? All of these issues would have been perfectly familiar in 1919, and the men of 1945 knew it. The one exception, of course, is the secret that Harry Truman thought he and only a couple of other people knew, and that was the atomic bomb experiments that were going on in Alamogordo, New Mexico. What the atomic bomb did, of course, was raise the stakes, make it so that these issues are even more important in 1945 in their minds than they had been in 1919. So three nations are going to run it. I like this photograph. This one comes from relatively early in the conference. That is, of course, a smiling Joseph Stalin on the left. The brand new American president, Harry Truman, his brand new Secretary of State, James Burns, arm in arm with the Soviet Foreign Minister, Molotov. And I like this photograph for a number of reasons. One, they're all smiling. And again, this is important to understand. I don't think this is just mugging for the camera. They've come to Potsdam having done what they wanted to do. They defeated Germany. This is a conference of victors. Unlike Yalta, unlike Tehran, unlike Quebec, this is a conference of victors. The other thing I like about this photograph is Burns and Molotov arm in arm. Now, these two guys didn't really like each other. They didn't really trust each other. They came from very diverse systems. But Burns left Potsdam thinking he had read this man. He could work with him. Burns famously said, they're like politicians everywhere. If I build them a post office, they'll build me a post office. He was wrong, but that's okay. The Soviet Union set the place. The United States had first proposed holding the conference right here in Washington or holding it in Alaska. if the Russians wanted to be closer to Russian territory, the Russians said the only place that they would meet was Potsdam, somewhere in the Berlin suburbs. The United States set the timing. Truman tried to delay the conference as long as possible, hold it in July instead of in June, and that was both to give him some time to figure out his new responsibilities and to give the scientists in New Mexico as much time as he possibly could. The United Kingdom symbolically only set the code name. Winston Churchill came up with the code name Terminal for this conference, and it's a code name that is immediately broadcast, so not much utility in that. Great Britain is bankrupt and isolated. They are aware, as the British Prime Minister Anthony Eden wrote in a memorandum shortly before the conference, that the only way Great Britain can achieve its policy objectives is by tying it to the United States as much as possible. Winston Churchill tried to do this by constantly using phrases like the way we Anglo-Americans look at things, phrases that drove Harry Truman crazy, and in one rather silly event, trying to put his chair closer and closer to Truman's during a photo session. Truman saw what he was doing and kept moving his chair closer and closer to Stalin. Stalin, in the meantime, just sat there laughing the entire time. Of the three powers, it's quite clear that it's Great Britain that is the one that is not only the least powerful, but aware of its lack of power. And again, the issue of the role of personalities. Franklin Roosevelt had held the American presidency since 1933. It is remarkable to me that in 1944, when they were selecting a vice president, they did not discuss Roosevelt's health, and they did not make the choice of Harry Truman based on Roosevelt's health. That is, they did not make the decision in 1944 on the basis that the vice president would one day have to become the president. They instead made the decision on the basis that whatever you picked in 1944, that person would likely fade into obscurity, just as Roosevelt's other vice presidents would. Go ahead, see if you can name them. In 1944, the obvious choice would have been James Burns. Burns is the only man in American history to have served on the Supreme Court, the House of Representatives, the United States Senate, the Cabinet, and later as South Carolina governor, all without ever having gone to college, which is also true, by the way, of Harry Truman. He knew everybody in Washington. He knew most of the people overseas, the key players overseas, and if they thought they were selecting the next president, Burns would have been the obvious choice, his firm beliefs in segregation and his rather difficult personality notwithstanding. Instead, they picked Truman, who was prepared to enter Burns's name into the convention. You can still see pictures of Roosevelt and Burns signs at the Chicago Convention in 1944. Instead, they turned to Truman and tell him that he's been named. Truman gave his acceptance speech at the convention, 90 seconds, with no discussion of policy at all. He wasn't prepared to give the speech. When he became vice president, Secretary of War Henry Stimson didn't see the need to brief Truman, even on the atomic bomb project. Roosevelt met with him only twice, and neither time did they discuss anything substantive. When he became president of the United States, Harry Truman couldn't even find the official records of what had been agreed to at Yalta. It was the first time he had gone into the map room, what is today the rough equivalent of the Situation Room. And one of his aides says he stood at the map, Truman did, having no idea even where to find some of the places they were talking about. On the other hand, in Great Britain, something similar happens. That's Clement Attlee on the left, a man that Winston Churchill once derided as a sheep in sheep's clothing, which is a great line. Another British wag said that with Attlee replacing Winston Churchill, the big three would become the big 2.5. Clement Attlee is more than he looks. Clement Attlee in 1915 was the second to last man off the beaches at Gallipoli. Clement Attlee, the Labour Party leader, was one of the first to stand up to Francisco Franco's regime in Spain. There were international brigades named after him. Nevertheless, he didn't quite look like Winston Churchill. He didn't act like Winston Churchill. He certainly didn't have Winston Churchill's wit or his commanding presence. In the middle of this conference, to everybody's great surprise, including Attlee's, by the way, the Labour Party won an overwhelming majority, meaning that in the middle of this conference, Winston Churchill and his foreign minister, Anthony Eden, stay home, and Clement Attlee comes to Potsdam as the leader of Great Britain. Attlee had rented a cottage on the shore on the expectation that the election would return a big majority for Churchill, and Churchill would not ask him to come back to Potsdam. That's how little he expected to win this. Attlee's foreign minister, Sir Ernest Bevin, was equally surprised. Bevin, a huge man that made Attlee look even smaller. He walked up to Anthony Eden after the election. Eden said, "What cabinet position are you going to go for?" Bevin said, "I think I want the Chancellor of the Exchequer." And Eden said, "Why? All you'll do there is account for the money we no longer have. Ask to be foreign minister." And that's what he did. Still, what was notable to me, and people observed it in 1945, that the fundamental positions of the United States and Great Britain did not change. In this case, Harry Truman is of the same party, but Clement Attlee's even coming from a different political party, the Labor Party rather than the Conservative Party. Everybody around them understood it was the circumstance and the structure that was more important than the personality. Another issue for the Americans. This is Truman with his Russia team. The most famous man in this picture, probably after Truman, is the guy second from the right, George Kennan, who wrote the famous long telegram in 1947, as to how to read the Russians. What is it that they're up to? And there were at least three views. There was Chip Boland's view, shared by some of the British delegates, that what the Russians were really trying to do in 1945 was restore what the Tsar had in 1914. In other words, ideology didn't matter. The Russians are going to do the same thing that they would do regardless of ideology. What they're doing is geopolitical. They're trying to protect their western border. They're trying to secure their control over Eastern Europe. Chip Boland said on that basis, you can expect the Russians to push back if you push them on Eastern Europe. On the other hand, however, you don't have to worry about them reaching for places where they traditionally had had little influence. A second view, and it's mostly a British view, although there are some Americans, including notably the American ambassador to the Soviet Union, Avril Harriman, who argued that you needed to think about the Russians as global revolutionaries. You needed to think about them as a state that was going to try to export its ideology all over the world. And you had to do something at Potsdam to make sure that that didn't happen. The third, and the view that I think is probably the one that has held up the best, was Kennan's. And of course, he'll articulate it later much more fully in the so-called long telegram. Kennan argued that the Second World War had exaggerated all of the worst elements of the Russian system, their paranoia, their fear of security, all of the things that made them Russian. At the same time, however, the collapse of Germany meant that even though Russia had suffered so brutally during the Second World War, it would emerge more powerful. What Kennan argued was that the United States would face an uphill battle, a devastating, potentially lethal uphill battle, if the United States tried to push the Russians out of any place where they were. What the Americans should do is contain the Russians, don't let them expand any further, but the way to defeat the Russians was to let the internal contradictions of the Russian system collapse it of its own accord. Build up your own strength, and let the Russian weakness take care of the problem. So Truman has in one ear the hardliners, who are telling him to take a firm stand. They include the Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, and they include Harriman, the ambassador. He's also got other softliners talking in his other ear. He's got people like Joseph Davies telling him, no, the Russians are still our allies. This conference is about settling matters with Germany, not Russia. We still need the Russians in Asia. We need the Russians if any kind of post-war peace is going to last. You got to go easy with them. And the remarkable thing to me, up until this point, Harry Truman had never in his life had a conversation with a Russian. Never once. The first one he has is with Molotov, who is a tough Russian to deal with. This is where the conference happened. The Crown Prince's Palace, Cecilienhof in Potsdam. That red star of geraniums, the Soviets planted before the conference. So when delegates drove up to the courtyard right there, that's the first thing that they saw. It's still there if you go there today to see it. It's in the Russian zone of control under the rules of the occupation. The Russians evacuated all of the Germans living in Potsdam and Babelsberg and filled the houses with whatever furniture they could find, whatever they could get, the best pieces they could find anywhere in Berlin, Potsdam, or Babelsberg. They just put them in the houses that the delegates would sit in, leading to some interesting commentary, especially from the British. Clement Attlee is very disappointed. He says, I can't believe this is what the German middle class prefers, this style of architecture and furniture. Maximum security, no British or American press allowed for most of the conference. Security that confounded the Americans and the British. They couldn't believe the extent to which the Russians had gone. And although the devastation of Germany, the devastation of Berlin, and the devastation of Europe was evident for all to see, there was nothing left wanting for the delegates. When Anthony Eden, who was suffering from ulcers, complained about the German milk, they went back to Britain and got him British milk. When Harry Truman didn't like the sheet music that they had for playing the piano, he sent a plane to go and get sheet music from Paris. The only way that the press was able to get any access to Potsdam at all was by threatening to publish reports about the luxury within which these men were living while the rest of Europe was starving. It's also true that there were very few non-white faces at this conference. The United States Navy had brought mess stewards in, Filipino mess stewards in, to serve the president his meals, and the Russians had brought men from Central Asia as part of the security teams. Other than that, I think it's safe to argue that Potsdam is the acme, it's the high point of white Europeans believing that they could control the destiny of people from other continents. All right, what I'd like to do is focus on the United States in the time that I have remaining. This is a photograph of Harry Truman taking the oath of office. There are two things I would like you to notice in this photograph. Not a single person is smiling, because of course they're still dealing with the immense tragedy of Franklin Roosevelt's death. And the second, and it's no coincidence, Harry Truman is taking the oath of office under a portrait of Woodrow Wilson. It is the same room where Franklin Roosevelt worked on his plans for the United Nations. Again, not a coincidence. The idea here is to rescue the fundamental principles and ideas of Woodrow Wilson, but to put them into action in a way that will work much better. And Truman is aware of that. Truman's also aware, as much as he admired Wilson, that Wilson had gone to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 largely hoping to win on principles. Harry Truman has made the decision that he's not going to do that. He's going to keep the Wilsonian principles, but he's going to bring with him instruments of national power with which he can put them into play. They include a favorable Senate, which Woodrow Wilson never had. Harry Truman came out of that body and made sure that before he went to Potsdam, he had the Senate vote on both the Bretton Woods International Economic Agreements, which I'll talk about in just a second, and a vote on the United Nations, so that when he went to Potsdam, he had the will and support of the American people through their elected representatives. He also knew that he would have in his pocket a number of other instruments of national power. He would have the United Nations, which, unlike the League of Nations, is not going to represent every state equally. As you all know, it will have 5 permanent voting members, the United States, of course, being one of those. Unlike the League of Nations, this one is going to reside in the United States. The first meeting is in San Francisco, notably in the Opera House in San Francisco, built as a memorial for the men who died in the First World War. That symbolism was not by accident. And it will be headquartered in New York City. The United Nations is going to be like the kinds of instruments that the United States wants to build at the end of the Second World War. They are multilateral institutions that the United States dominates and controls, or has an outsized vote in. This is the same way the United States is going to deal with the refugee problem in Europe, by creating something called UNRWA, the United Nations Rehabilitation and something Association, which the United States will also dominate through its outsized money and power, but for which the United States is not alone responsible. Maybe the more important, it's based right by my hotel, is the Bretton Woods International Economic Agreements, which create the World Bank, they create the International Monetary Fund, and they move the international reserve currency from the British pound to the American dollar. And this is a photograph of John Maynard Keynes, the British economist, who called the Bretton Woods agreements a swindle. The Bank of England officials said that the only thing worse than signing the Bretton Woods Agreement would have been losing the war to the Germans. What Keynes understood, what the Bank of England officials understood, is that Bretton Woods was the only choice that the British had, but that it would end Great Britain's role as the global reserve and the global economic power. It would also likely end the imperial preference system, that is, the system by which Britain could keep trade inside the British Empire. Hereafter, it was possible that 2 elements of the British Empire, say India and Singapore, might well conduct their business in American dollars. However, Keynes himself said that Great Britain could not continue to police half the world while remaining in debt to the other half. And John Maynard Keynes left the conference at Bretton Woods, went to Ottawa, and somehow got from the Canadian government $500 million of emergency aid to Great Britain. It's an important thing to remember just how broke Great Britain was. Britain remained on food rationing until 1953. There is an irony here that some British officials picked up on. The French certainly picked up on it. The British were making the same argument in 1945 that the French had made in 1919. That is, we're broke, but you have to understand the blood that we have sacrificed. We're owed something because of how hard we fought and how much we did. The British rejected that argument when the French made it in 1919, and the Americans rejected it when the British made it in 1945. The last card in Truman's hand, of course, was the atomic bomb. Now, as a senator, Harry Truman had found the $2 billion gap in the federal budget. He went to then Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, and he asked what that money was for. And Henry Stimson told him, I can't tell you. You have to take my word for it, I can't tell you. Senator Truman accepted that. Vice President Truman, same Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, Stimson did not tell Vice President Truman what that money had been for. Now, as president, he has to know. He got the note at Potsdam telling him that the Trinity test had succeeded. It's a very interesting note. It's in the book if you want to read it. letting him know that this had actually worked. Remember, the Manhattan Project was a shared British-American project, so the British are in on this secret as well. Truman and Churchill had a long meeting about what they should do about it there at Potsdam. They had to tell Stalin something. They made the decision not to use the word atomic, and they also made the decision to introduce it to Stalin as casually as possible. So at the end of one of the lunchtime sessions, Truman went up to Stalin and told him, "We have a new bomb of extraordinary ability." The sources are a little bit contradictory on what Stalin actually said, but he appears to have turned to Truman and said, "Wonderful, a new bomb, wonderful," and turned and walked away. Truman and Churchill had concluded that that meant that Stalin had no idea what they were telling him. Of course, Stalin knew everything about what they were telling him. Although there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that Harry Truman meant it this way, he happened to mention this to Stalin shortly after an intense disagreement over the borders of Poland. Stalin thought the timing was anything but accidental. He used the word blackmail to one of his translators. Truman and James Burns were literally at sea when the atomic bomb was used over Hiroshima, and Burns's personal secretary wrote in his notebook, "The news was delivered to President Truman and Secretary Burns. They hit the bourbon bottle pretty hard." What he didn't do was write another sentence. What I don't know is whether they were hitting the bourbon bottle pretty hard in celebration, or because they were aware, as Burns later said, that a new era in the history of the world had begun. Burns believed, many British observers believed, and I believe, it was the explosion over Hiroshima and Nagasaki that truly begins the path that leads us on the way to the Cold War. The Russians simply could not see that device as anything but an existential threat to them. Okay, let me wrap up and then leave some time to take your questions. Two major outcomes of this conference that have to be seen in connection with 1919, have to be seen as corrections to what had happened at the Treaty of Versailles. The first one is a decision on what to do with borders in 1945. In 1919, the great powers had tried to figure out, whereas Woodrow Wilson wrote, where distinguishably Polish people live, and then draw a border around them. What they figured out in 1919, of course, is that you can't do that. In 1945, they took a different approach. They moved both borders and people. Most of this is done by the Red Army. The estimates now are that as many as 35 million people may have been forcibly relocated by the Russian army. People that are ethnically Polish will be forcibly moved into the new Poland. Ethnic Germans, of course, will be pushed into Germany. Two things happened as a result. One, the effort to move people and move borders meant that the humanitarian cost on people was far higher than anything that had happened at the end of the First World War, with one exception, which is the decision that Greece and Turkey made in the early 1920s to exchange populations, ethnic Turks to Turkey, ethnic Greeks to Greece. A model, by the way, that the British saw as a positive model. The Americans knew, and the British knew, that the Russians were forcibly relocating people. All the Americans and British required of the Russians is that they do so in, quote, a humane manner. The papers of the American Chief of Staff, Admiral Leahy, make it pretty clear that the Americans understood what was happening, understood the human cost, and accepted it. This is a temporary solution to solve a permanent problem. It is Poland, of course, that paid the price. It is the Poles, above all, that ended up with Soviet control over the Polish state. In 1945, however, the Americans and British believed two things. They believed, one, that they had given Poland much of the best of German territory. Much of what's in the north of the new Poland is what had been East Prussia, the heartland of Germany. And second, there was still the belief, when the two sides left Potsdam, that the form of the Polish government had not yet been decided. That is, it still could be an elected democratic government. Truman himself, in his speech to the American people, identified the agreement over Poland as the one thing of the Potsdam Agreement with which he remained uncomfortable. Nevertheless, it remains true that if Poland was a reason for great powers to go to war in 1939, it was not a reason for great powers to go to war in 1945. The second thing is the division of Germany. And I want to highlight this here. The division of Germany was done in 1945. This map division of Germany was done to settle the reparations question. That is, it was done to solve another 1919 problem. It's James Burns's idea. What's happening in Burns's mind is the Russian control, what becomes East Germany, the Russians had decided to take their reparations in kind. In other words, just take whatever they could find in Germany. They formed what they called trophy brigades and went around East Germany classifying everything as a military asset and taking it away. In the West, the Russians wanted cash reparations coming out of the American and British and later the French zone. The way Burns saw this, unless the American people were willing to watch the German people starve to death over the winter of 1945-46, it meant that the Russians would be taking assets out of Germany at the same time that the Americans and British were putting assets in. In other words, it would repeat the problem of the 1920s, of the United States effectively funneling money through Germany into the Soviet Union. And Burns didn't want to do that. Great Britain wasn't even sure that it could afford to do that. It also had to deal with the famine in India that had killed 3 million Indians, and it had to deal with the problems that were still existing inside the United Kingdom. It's why Clement Attlee gets elected to the prime ministry. I can talk about that more in the question and answer period if you like. So it was Burns's idea that each side would take reparations out of the part of Germany that they occupied. What that meant was that the Russians could continue doing the removal of the physical plant, but they would have no access to the cash reparations from the industrialized zones in the West that Burns wanted to protect. In Burns's mind, Germany would remain one political unit, but the reparations would come out of individual sectors. This was a way to protect the Western assets and acknowledge what was already happening, that the United States could not stop the in-kind removals in 1945 from the Eastern sector. In other words, the division of Germany itself is a function of trying to create a solution to a problem that had been created in 1919. And Burns is upfront about it. There was no intention at Potsdam to keep Germany divided for years, let alone decades. And I want to stress, these decisions did solve the problems of 1945 as the men at Potsdam understood them. Again, they believed they were there to solve the problems of Eastern Europe and Germany, and they believed that they had done that. They also believed that they had fixed the mistakes of 1919 as they understood them. Therefore, it is critical, in my mind, to understand this moment in history and to understand Potsdam as representing the final paragraph of the chapter of history that began on a street corner in Sarajevo in 1914. In the new chapter of the ongoing story of Europe, great powers in the world, Berlin, Poland, and Yugoslavia would appear less as actors in their own right than as pawns in a new game of superpower rivalry. And if the men at Potsdam in the summer of 1945 could not predict the future, they at least knew the past that they were desperately trying not to repeat. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Michael, questions need to be done at the microphones, if you don't mind.
You want me to go to them?
No.
They'll come to the microphone. Gotcha. There have to be some. You're going to let me get away with this?
Could you explain how the Russians, the Soviets, ended up with Kaliningrad?
Yeah, it's simply by force. It's how they end up with virtually everything. I think it's Stimson that makes the argument that the Russians have 99 and 44 1/100ths of the argument because their forces are sitting there. Where the Soviet forces are is where they're going to control. It's important to remember, too, this is 1945. This is July. The United States has the atomic weapon but doesn't know whether it's going to work. The American military strategic problem in 1945 is Japan. So there is no desire to leave American forces in Europe. The Soviets, on the other hand, are certainly going to leave forces in Europe. Yes, sir.
Yeah, two questions. At least my understanding is that Churchill, obviously before he's removed in the middle of this conference, had been in conversations with the Soviet Union basically about some type of division of Europe. What did the Americans know about that, and did they build on that understanding at this conference? In essence, you talk about Poland being somewhat unsettled, but I think most people were quite aware that,
Yeah, so
that
Churchill,
Poland was going to fall much more into the Soviet sphere than in the American sphere. That's the first question. The second question is the important question of the nuclear weapon, right? And the way Stalin reacts to it, right? There's some historical proof now that you suggested it, that he knew a lot about it and that he wanted to do to the Americans like, I don't care you have nuclear weapons, in essence, we will get them quickly, and you have to be careful what you're doing here. But we know that internally they were tremendously troubled about what is going on. So maybe you can talk more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll deal with the second one first. I mean, the Soviets read the atomic bomb as an existential threat to them. I don't know that Stalin took the approach. I mean, we know less about Stalin, obviously, than the other two. What we certainly know is that he was determined. He believed, and so did Molotov, that the atomic bomb shifted the balance of power between the former allies far too much for Soviet security. Interesting, the British come to the same conclusion. So Bevin, the same foreign minister that's at Potsdam, later on says Britain needs to have an independent nuclear deterrent. It has to have it independent of the Americans. The phrase he uses is, there's got to be a bloody Union Jack on that thing. So there is an awareness as early as 1945 that nuclear weapons are something completely different, and they're going to set superpowers apart from other powers. If you have them, you'll be in the club, and if you don't have them, you won't be in the club. And Alan Brooke, the senior soldier in the British Army, writes a phenomenally interesting diary note at Potsdam in which he says, look, Churchill thinks that because we have this atomic bomb, we can now do whatever we want. And he writes in this diary entry, Churchill doesn't understand. This is a weapon that once the Japanese surrender, it's a weapon you can never use again except as a deterrent. And Churchill doesn't get it. It's a phenomenally interesting note. Your other question, there had been agreements before, of course. At Yalta, there had been kind of gentlemen agreements about about where the Soviet forces would go, where American forces would go, where British forces would go. There are two problems, though. The first is, and this is true, when Truman became president, they could not find the official minutes of Yalta. They could not show them to Truman. So Truman is quite literally walking to cabinet members and people that had been at Yalta and saying, do you know what we agreed to do? What was your recollection? So based on that, Truman is unwilling to put American authority behind agreements that he thinks maybe somebody made, but he's not sure. And that's true. They couldn't find the minutes. The second thing is that very early on in the conference, Burns and Molotov have this discussion. Is what we agreed to at Yalta still on the table? And the Russians say no, because our suffering between Yalta and now had been so much greater, 300,000 casualties to take Berlin, we're now owed more. And Burns, for his part, says, look, we don't want to follow what's gone on at Yalta either, because it's a different administration. So yes, those agreements are in place. No, those agreements are not unchangeable. Sir.
It was a marvelous speech.
Thank you.
I have to see it again on YouTube many times
You'll be the only one, but thank you.
to absorb a lot of it. But two small points. You said that Stalin knew everything when they said we have a new bomb.
Well, he knew of the atomic bomb project.
Is that because of Klaus Fuchs?
I don't know exactly. It's Beria that's running his spy network for him into New Mexico. I don't know exactly who was doing the reporting back to him, but he certainly had.
You're inferring that he knew about the.
Absolutely.
Okay. The other small thing is, you said that the Situation Room is where the map room used to be.
No. If I said that, I misspoke. The map room is what we would today call the Situation Room. It's the secret room where the president and his advisors met.
Because the map room, as I understand it, where Clinton was deposed, is where Franklin Roosevelt watched the map of Europe, the Nazi advance, above the fireplace. Is that still the map room? I mean, it is still, but was it?
I'm not a specialist. I've never even been in the White House. But one of the things that Truman oversaw was a complete overhaul of the White House. There's these wonderful pictures where they got the entire inside. Yeah. So my guess is that physically it bears no resemblance. But when Washington officials talk about the map room in the 1940s, they're referring to what we would refer to as a situation room. We're referring to the top secret room that you go to for your discussion.
Thank you.
I don't know. Colonel Arnold, have you been in this situation room before? Or near it? Can you answer that question? Can neither confirm nor deny. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's exactly the answer I would have expected. Hi, John.
Hi, Mike. Thanks very much. That was really a terrific talk on an important subject, and I'm looking forward to reading the whole book. I just wanted to bring a possible clarification to what an earlier questioner had asked. I think that what he may have been asking about was not the Yalta conference, but rather the bilateral British-Russian, British-Soviet so-called Tolstoy talks, I think in January of 1945, in which Churchill is said to have passed a piece of paper describing a possible division of spheres of influence
Yeah.
between Britain and
Right, the
Soviet Union.
75-25 agreement. that
Yes,
kind
and
of
it's often portrayed as a kind of a pathetic, sort of ex parte approach on the part of Britain when they were in no position actually to exercise that kind of power anymore.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. And of course, since it's a bilateral, the key is that it's between two parties, meaning the United States is not a party to it and is not obligated. And of course, it's not an official document. It's written, I don't know quite on a cocktail napkin, but pretty close. And I'm not a specialist in Soviet diplomatic history, but the sources seem to suggest Stalin checked it knowing that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what Churchill thinks he's getting. And Stalin's descriptions of Churchill are incredibly belittling in private. He had absolutely no respect for Churchill. So, but yeah, thanks for that clarification. Sir.
Thank you very much also. And I know as an historian, you'll probably shy away from this, but I wanted to see if I could tempt you into reflecting for us on what President Putin might think about this conference and its aftermath relative to current events.
So the first thing I have to do in answering that question is say that anything that I say next is my opinion only, does not represent the U.S. Army War College, the U.S. Army, or the Department of Defense. So that's out of the way. You know, to the Russians, you know, I could go back to this. I mean, I think some version of this is still happening, trying to figure out what it is that the Russians actually are doing. You know, are they trying to, and I've seen the arguments made, are they trying to go back to the 1945 geopolitical situation? Are they trying to go back to the 1914 geopolitical situation? Or are they trying to overturn that verdict and grab for more? I'm not a specialist in Soviet foreign policy. My supposition is that those debates are happening. As to what the Russians are thinking, I mean, they were the hardest to read in doing this book, both because I don't have the languages, I'm not at the archives, and you know, Russian historians don't agree on what the Russians were trying to accomplish. As to what, I would not even hazard a guess as to what Vladimir Putin might be thinking, except perhaps to note that this was a period when Russia could negotiate out of strength rather than out of weakness, which is what the Russians do. Other than that, I'm not going to even try to guess what's going on in Putin's mind.
I would ask, at the beginning of your talk, you suggested that coming out of Potsdam, most of the players basically thought that, you know, they came out of it in pretty good shape and maybe things weren't so bad for the future, the Cold War wasn't imminent. So slightly outside the scope of the book, as a high school history teacher who frequently, our students are told, well, Potsdam laid the groundwork.
Yeah.
What would you say then would be then the larger trigger in your mind for what then causes what we know as the Cold War?
So what I can say is what the participants themselves believed. And, you know, Truman says it as well in the 1948 midterm elections, 46 midterm elections. He actually writes a letter. I saw it. Thanks to the National Archives. The letter is there. Though I didn't take notes on it, though I did remark on it. Truman says, look, these people are trying to get elected in the United States by inflating an international threat that isn't there to get elected. You need to cool it down. Like, we have this. It's under control. In my view, the Cold War is not inevitable. It is the result of policy decisions made in London, Washington, Moscow, other places as well. It's an event that builds. I don't know that there is a single trigger. You could go back to 1917 and see the origins of the Cold War. You can probably go back to Peter the Great and see origins of the Cold War. All I can say with absolute certainty is people left Potsdam believing a future of cooperation with Russia was certainly possible. There were going to be difficulties. There were going to be bumps in the road. Burns actually writes he's more worried about Britain than he is Russia. He thinks Great Britain is going to use its military assets to try to recover India, go back to Singapore, and rebuild its empire. Burns actually makes the incredibly prophetic statement that the best ally that America can hope for is a rebuilt and democratic Germany, which is a remarkable thing to say in 1945. So, again, in my view, history is not inevitable. The weight of history is not deterministic. People made policy choices, and they made decisions about the ways they wanted to see things, both in Russia and in the United States, and again in other places as well. There may be a trigger to starting the Cold War. Potsdam's not it. Sir.
Great lecture. Two questions on borders. One, first with Poland, with the shifting of the borders to the west. why would the Russians advocate such a thing when they thought Poland did not exist?
Yeah.
Post-World War I, and yet, so basically, who's defending the Poles' interest in moving the borders to the west?
That's a great question. Actually,
Certainly not
nobody's
the
defending the
Russians.
Poles' interest. Yeah.
But,
Yeah, no,
so I'm just curious.
So Poland is a very complicated topic. Very briefly put, there are two Polish governments leading into Potsdam. There is the so-called Lublin Poles who are pro-Soviet and the so-called London Poles who are pro-Allied. Churchill is so tired of the London Poles that he doesn't even want them coming to Potsdam. He's tired of dealing with them. He just says, look, I wash my hands of Poland. The issue of borders is an interesting one because there is a border from the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, which is called the Curzon Line, which is almost exactly the same border as the 1939 division of Poland that becomes known as the Ribbentrop-Molotov Line. At Potsdam, the Americans decide not to use the Molotov-Ribbentrop line, not to use the words, because it insults the Soviets. So they go back and they use the phrase Curzon Line. It's almost exactly the same line. Obviously, what the Poles want is the biggest Poland that they can possibly get. I think what's happening is that the Russians are saying it doesn't matter where the borders of Poland actually sit. If we control the Polish government, we control it. Yeah. So it may say Poland on the map, but that doesn't really matter. So what they're arguing for is an expanded Poland, not for Poland's sake, but if you slide Poland to the west, Russia's border moves west, and Poland's border moves west. And that does two things. It puts Soviet forces potentially closer into the heart of Europe, and if you take a look at the map, it eliminates Prussia. So today, there is no geographic entity officially recognized as Prussia. It's gone. And to the Russians, that's a great thing. To the Americans, it's a great thing, right? It takes that traditional heart of the state that had caused the problems for the past 30 years, and it literally wipes it off the map. But your point gets to an absolutely important fundamental point. There is really nobody arguing the case of the Poles. And the American ambassador to Poland wrote a book called I Saw Poland Betrayed. He's trying to make the case for Poland. And the fundamental fact is, as I said, if people were interested in going to war over it in 1939, there is nobody interested in going to war for it 6 years later. Nobody.
Thank you. And then the second quick border question is, the comment about how Germany was divided, it sounded like primarily for reparations, but at the same time, there was another theory in Truman's cabinet, if I understood you correctly, saying that, the Soviets, the Russians, are not going to leave territory that they've taken. And you mentioned also that Malta was off the table. Well, the Russians took Berlin, and did anybody really think they were going to exit? And was it really reparations, or was it real estate the Russians already occupied that where the border ended up?
So it's really interesting. Anthony Eden wrote a memorandum in which he's kind of aware of that, right? That the Russians are sitting in these places. What cards do we have to get them out, right? What he says is there's no way to force them out. There's no way. And when Patton makes his silly statement about keeping the bayonet sharp, right? The unanimous opinion that guy is a general. He needs to keep his mouth shut on political issues, right? No influence at all. No one has any stomach for taking on the Russians. No one, especially since Japan remains undefeated. And the cards that Eden sees are actually really weak cards, and he knows they're weak, right? You can give them some part of the merchant fleet that they want, the German merchant fleet that they want. You could give them some scientific non-nuclear secrets that the Germans have that are in Allied possessions. But there's really no instrument of power you can use to get them out of where they are. On the other hand, what you could do is agree a policy, a mutual occupation and administration policy for Germany in the post-war world that will make all of the great powers have skin in that game. That you could do. And then what that would do would keep keep the Russians at the negotiating table. In other words, you could have them on the inside of the tent rather than on the outside of the tent. And that's really what the intent is. So when they come up with this plan for reparations, the idea is to keep Germany together as one administrative unit. This division is done to try to figure out how to handle the reparations question. It becomes a political issue after it becomes a reparations issue. Does that answer your question?
Somewhat, yes. Thank you.
Thanks. Final question. Yes, sir.
I know the question is called for total speculation, but since you pointed out and know what happened with the great change of people and Roosevelt not being there, what guesses are there as to what would have happened had Roosevelt lived and been in decent enough health to have negotiated there?
So the best way I can answer that, the one person who really talked about it was the guy on the far right, Charles Chip Bolin, who was Truman's and Roosevelt's Russian translator and closest advisor on Russian matters. And Bolin himself made the observation. He said Truman didn't do anything differently than Roosevelt would have done. He said what was different was the language. Roosevelt was diplomatic and courteous. Truman was much more blunt, much more direct, much more willing to say tough things to the Russians. But he said in terms of what American political behavior was, Bolin said there was no difference. And interestingly, he notes that's not because Truman is trying to copy what Roosevelt was doing. It's because there were really very few options that the Americans had. And to me, that was one of the things about Potsdam that was so interesting. There is this weight of history, a weight of geopolitics over these guys that they may or may not be aware of, but that is nevertheless constraining the options that they have. And again, the same thing is true in Great Britain. So my guess is, based on what Bolin observed and what some others observed, even if Franklin Roosevelt had been there instead of Harry Truman, not much would have come out all that differently.
So there would have been a Cold War in either case.
Maybe, maybe not. Roosevelt might have been able to steer some things in a way, I don't know, but you know, you're asking for what historians call a counterfactual. You're asking me to prove something that never happened, and as I told the teachers in this institute, I'm much happier doing that in a bar than I am in an academic setting. Thanks for your question.